All right. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Partnerships Legislative Session Debrief. We're so happy to have all of you joining us. Just so you know, this is being recorded, and we'll get that recording out to folks who have joined along with the slides once we've concluded today. I'm Amy Peltier. I am the Coalition and Advocacy Director here at the partnership. And I'm just going to go through our agenda really quick before I pass it off to our panelists. Thank you so much, Danielle. Today we are going to hear from Alysha Gardner, our Senior Policy Analyst on budget adjustments from the legislative session. Then we'll hear from Ghio, our Policy Director, and finally Danielle Hubley, um, our I'm like Advocacy and Education Manager. She's going to close us out with some advocacy opportunities and ways to get involved. We'd also like to hear your questions, so you don't have to wait until the end of the webinar to put your questions in the Q&A box, please, and we'll monitor them as we go along. And then we're actually going to pause after each speaker to kind of ask questions on the topics that are covered individually. So please drop your questions in there and we'll get them to the speakers. We're also going to share a link in the chat here, Danielle, if you wanted to advance, where you can click and sign up for the written analysis of the session and how it kind of fell short of meeting the needs of affordable housing that advocates work so hard to lay out. And then additionally, you can use this QR code to receive the bill tracker. That's a more in-depth analysis of really what Alysha and Sean will go through here today. So thanks again for joining. I'm going to turn it over to Alysha, and please don't forget to drop your questions in the Q&A, and we'll address them later. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Amy. So today I'm going to take us through the FY27 budget adjustments. As far as housing is concerned, the legislature didn't make any major changes apart from some pretty significant investments in the rental assistance program. However, there are several minor adjustments that are worth understanding if you work in the housing or housing finance field. So the rental assistance program this year, there were pretty major changes in both fiscal years, which is pretty unique. As just a quick overview, the rental assistance program is a state-funded voucher program like federal Section 8 that subsidizes rental costs for low-income renters. Due to rising rental costs in the state actually needs to spend more money per voucher to keep the same number of people housed, which has been difficult in recent years as appropriations do not typically keep pace with the increased cost. So the 2025 biennial budget actually made a huge step in this direction last year with 8.8 million in each year FY26 and FY27 to keep up with the rising housing costs. Last year they also appropriated $6.7 million in the last session to expand the program with new vouchers this year in July. So this July, 600 new vouchers are coming online, including 250 for families with young children through Head Start on Housing, 250 for elderly and disabled individuals and households, and 75 for adults with developmental disabilities. So that's what happened last year. The good news is that we got 27 million additional dollars for WRAP this session. The bad news is that none of this new money is actually going towards new vouchers. So we'll break it down. There was 17 million that was in FY26, so the current year, to keep up with the cost of the program's rising rents. So putting that all together, there's 25 million just in this fiscal year to keep up with rising costs. And then there was an additional 9.1 million in FY27 that will also presumably go towards the rising rental costs, though there's a few small things that we can say kind of are tucked into that 9.1 million. So the governor noted in a press release that 250,000 of that will go towards contracting for more RAP housing inspectors, which will help with placement for existing voucher holders. There was also 500,000 proposed at the beginning of the session as a partnership with the Department of Education to provide supportive services alongside RAP vouchers for homeless youth. It's unclear right now whether that was actually included in the final budget, so we're going to keep an eye out for the Office of Fiscal Analysis's budget book that comes out later this summer that will help us really understand what's in that 9.1 million. And lastly, the rental assistance program is now its own line item in the budget. Previously, it was lumped in with the housing and homeless services line item. Next slide. So the most important item outside of RAP is the 750,000 for new staff at the Department of Housing. As DOH's role and bond funding has sharply increased in the last 5 years or so, the staffing levels haven't kept pace. The governor originally proposed 12 new positions, which was 6 to implement last year's special session housing bill and its new programs, and then 6 to move fiscal monitoring in-house, which previously was contracted out. Based on press releases, our best estimate is that all 6 of the special session positions remain, as well as 3 positions for internal fiscal monitoring. But again, we'll confirm that once the budget book comes out later. Apart from the staffing, there are a few smaller changes which we don't have a lot of details on, including nearly $3 million in various grants to external organizations, and that's also another new line item for DOH. There was 250,000 moved from the Department of Children and Families to DOH to subgrant to a youth housing outreach program in Norwich, and there was a 20,000 reduction in the other expenses line item. Also, just to note that because RAP has now moved to its own line item, the total budget appropriations for the housing and homeless services line item has changed from roughly 114 million to 30 million. So you can see what a big part of that line item RAP took up. Next slide. So looking at the other state agencies, there were just a handful that had housing-related changes in the budget. The Department of Veterans Affairs had nearly $500,000 for more housing and support services for veterans at their Rocky Hill campus. The Department of Transportation received $500,000 for homeless encampment removal along Department of Transportation land, which typically covers highway underpasses, is what we're thinking of. Importantly, the legislature also passed in the Transportation Omnibus Bill, which was HB 5464, a requirement that DOT provide at least 14 days notice before clearing any homeless encampments, which is a significant change from the current 72-hour practice, and requires DOT and the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services to collaborate on a study on the best practices for humane and dignified treatment of those living in said encampments. So we're pleased that the funding for removal was accompanied by increased protections this year. The Connecticut Municipal Development Authority received $120,000 for staff and operations, as well as a $25 million increase in their bonding funds, which brings their FY27 bonding authorization total to $50 million. CMDA budgets under DECD and is a quasi-governmental agency that provides technical assistance to towns and helps facilitate their housing and economic development. There's a couple smaller items that I just wanted to note, including right to counsel. There was no new funding in the budget adjustment for right to counsel. However, the $4 million from last year's budget is going to carry forward. So the department has until the end of FY28 to spend it instead of FY27. And then the state also sunsetted its CHESS program this year, which was a Medicaid waiver program that allowed federal dollars to pay for housing supports for patients with high medical needs and housing insecurity. With the close of the waiver, the state is shifting responsibility for the approximately 100 patients that were served to the supportive housing program under the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services using existing RAP vouchers. And DMIS received $1 million to continue this program. All right, thanks, Danielle. Next slide. So there are 2 other major budget changes I'd like to highlight that include municipal aid and the Federal Cuts Response Fund. In an effort to respond to complaints about rising property taxes, this compromise budget proposed an aggregate $100 million one-time payment to municipalities. The way that this works would be that the budget relief to the towns allows the towns to temporarily lower their mill rates, providing property tax relief for homeowners for a single year. Each town received a different amount, ranging from $1,700 in the smallest town to $13 million in the largest cities, with an average grant size of around 600,000. This direct aid to confront housing costs does leave out the 1 in 3 Connecticut families who rent their homes. There were 2 renters tax credit proposals that had the support of the majority leader in the House and the Senate president and majority leader in the Senate, but they didn't pass, which is a huge missed opportunity. The legislature, secondly, with the federal cuts response fund, they added an additional $50 million to this fund, which was initially created in November with $500 million to serve as a buffer around uncertainty for federal policy changes to key safety net programs. And this fund would, in theory, allow the state to respond quickly and flexibly as the needs arise. We've seen them use it for housing supports in January, which was really fantastic. By February, there was $330 million remaining in the fund, so the $50 million investment brings the total to $380 million in reserves to use as needed. I did see that the governor actually put out about $35 million of that to UConn for research grants because of the federal cut. So it's around $350 million in reserves that can be used for federal policy changes and government shutdowns in the fall. One item that we're going to keep an eye on is the Safety Net Mitigation Working Group, which was created in the budget bill as kind of a paired task force, kind of working on the federal response. As written, the working group includes OPM, various state commissioners, and some legislators, but notably it doesn't include the housing commissioner, nor does the mandate explicitly target protecting housing programs. There was a similar bill that ultimately didn't pass, SB 401, that did include housing programs as a priority area in the state's federal response. So seeing that what actually passed didn't is something that we just want to be aware of. Given credible federal threats to supportive housing and rental assistance programs, we're going to continue to watch and advocate for the use of the Federal Cuts Response Fund to keep Connecticut families in their homes during this uncertain time. And bonding. So other than the additional $25 million authorized to CMDA that we mentioned earlier, there were no new housing-related bonding authorizations in the FY27 adjustments. However, the back of the budget bill made a few minor policy changes to some existing bond authorizations that we wanted to briefly review in case it's a program you interact with. So first, the $300 million set aside for the Concentrated Poverty Grant Program, which is also known as the High Poverty, Low Opportunity Census Tract Program, has now expanded eligible applicants from municipalities only to municipalities and community development corporations, or CDCs. This program targets census tracts with high poverty rates, and eligible projects include construction or rehab of mixed income rental housing and new homeownership opportunities. Earlier in the session, the Lamont administration did propose eliminating both the Concentrated Poverty Grant Program and bonding for CDCs, which was an additional $100 million over 2 years, in SB 307, which was not passed by the legislature. The administration hasn't spent any funds for the Concentrated Poverty Grant Program so far, despite having the authorizations for 2 years. So hopefully this change and modification will result in some forward momentum for the programs. Next up, for the Homes for CT Loan Program, is a new authorization from last session that helps facilitate the development of small starter homes through guarantees and loans. Following feedback from the home builders, this program has been updated to use a more common and transparent interest rate benchmark, the prime rate in the Wall Street Journal, and will now allow for grants and forgivable loans. The Healthcare Workforce Housing Bond authorization was issued in 2022 with $20 million, and DOH has only recently started allocating funds within the past 6 months. SB 1 directs DOH to seek partnerships to spend this money and directs them to provide progress updates to the Finance Revenue and Bonding Commission. We also received details on the Aging in Place bond authorization that was in last session's bond bill as well. The program will help elderly or disabled homeowners making less than 60% of the area median income by providing grants of up to 10,000 per homeowner to make accessibility modifications that will allow them to remain safely in their homes. And then lastly, CHAFA's Emergency Mortgage Assistance Program was very active to help keep people in their homes during the pandemic and has been carrying $5 million in unallocated funds for a number of years. So the bill now allows CHAFA to use these funds for down payment assistance program instead. And there is our overview of the budget. We're very appreciative of the RAP investments that help keep vouchers in circulation in the face of rising rental costs. But we know that this is only the first step, and we'd like to see investments in new and more RAP vouchers in the coming years, as well as sufficient investments in the existing programs. So I will pass it off to Amy and the rest of you for some Q&A.
Thank you so much, Alysha, and also just thank you for your work throughout the session, keeping track of so many of these things. It is a lot, and things shift quite a bit during session. I don't see any questions yet, so I can kick us off while folks maybe think about a question they have. Seeing that the rental assistance program, the RAP, is now has its own line item, can you talk a little bit about the significance or the implications of what that really means?
Thanks, Amy. The first really great thing is that it means that the legislators are paying attention. They know about this program, they care about this program, they want to know what's going on with this program. So to have a program elevated to a line item means that it has a lot of political attention and presumably political support. So we're pretty happy to see this shift. I believe it was a partnership priority a few years ago, is something we wanted. So it's nice to see the progress and the dialogue change over time on that. Another thing that's really helpful, especially from an advocacy perspective, is it will now be a lot easier to track what's actually going on. We can see, is the budget increasing year over year? How does it compare to rising rental costs? Before we've had to make do with our best guesses. So having its own line item means that we can pretty easily track year over year what's going on. There is one thing that's a little bit of a challenge with it being its own line item. Before, as a program, DOH had flexibility to shift unused funds into the rental
Mhm.
assistance program if they needed to keep vouchers in circulation if they didn't receive enough in appropriations. Because it's its own line item now, money can't cross between funds, so it loses that ability, which honestly puts the onus on the legislature to keep pace with inflation and rising rental costs. This is an issue that comes up with federal Section 8 vouchers every year. You know, you can put a little bit into the rental assistance program or Section 8 vouchers every year, but if you don't put enough to keep up with the rising rental costs, then you're going to lose vouchers. You're not going to have as many in circulation. So now that it's its own line item, there's a lot more transparency and there's a lot more responsibility for the legislature to continue to make sure they're investing enough year over year.
And makes it easier for hopefully advocates to track they're doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Yes.
I've got a couple questions here. One might be a quick answer if you or maybe Sean has it. If you know where folks can find a list of how much each municipality received in the property tax allocation.
Yeah, if you look in the chat and the link to our full budget analysis, you go in, you'll see the municipalities. There's actually a link in our blog to a list of the money going to the municipalities. It was released by the governor's press office. You could also go there and look at the press releases. But either one of those ways, you can go and find it out.
Great, thank you. One more. There is a question about the funds for removal of homeless from encampments, and curious if you, or from unsurpassed. I'm not sure I totally get that question, so maybe the person who asked it could clarify, but is the removal a right of removal or is there relocation, I would imagine support services to get folks into shelters, or is it really the removal we talked about just that time frame?
Yeah, I mean, the Department of Transportation is a very responsible actor. They have their own policy that they spent a couple years developing for homeless encampment removals that does include solicitation of removals to shelter. They already are making efforts to be in line with best policies. This isn't like a big bad DOT situation.
Hmm.
They're not sending them with nowhere to go. There is outreach that's involved with that 500,000. But we are grateful that now there's a little bit more transparency. The legislature can step in and have a say because it was an administration policy before. And now there's a requirement that it has to be at least 14 days notice. I think they do already do outreach, but this study that DOT and DMIS are supposed to collaborate on revising their policy specifically looks at how do you interact with the municipal social services? How do you interact with the housing services? How do you bridge this gap between the people? So we know that they're doing the best they can, and we know that the law that passed is going to make their policy even better.
Yeah. So again, something that helps with accountability, I think we're hoping. I think we have time for one more. Do you know if there's any marketing material available in supporting municipalities and CDCs applying for the concentrated poverty grants, or the
Um,
process of how that would work?
The program does not yet formally exist. So it exists in legislation. It has not been created by the Department of Economic and Community Development, and it has never been put on the bonding authorization, the bond commission's meeting. So once the money is authorized by the legislature, the governor gets to choose what to allocate to the agencies to actually spend it. And so far, no money for these programs has been allocated. So if this is something that's really important to you, I recommend, reaching out to your municipal leaders, to reach out to their contacts in the administration and the governor's office and the Department of Economic Community Development. Reach out to your legislatures and just kind of like make some noise that this is a really important um, opportunity that municipalities and CDCs are very excited for.
Yeah, and keeping an eye on probably that DCD website over time will probably be helpful as well.
And
Um,
just real quick, Amy, I will make a plug. The partnership has the Affordable Housing Development Resources tool that some of you may be familiar with. So you can look at different opportunities. A lot of them do go to municipalities or CDCs specifically. We have an update coming out in the next couple of months that includes as much legislative detail as we've been given on the CDC and Concentrated Poverty Grant Program. So it is quite detailed in the legislation, what types of projects are encouraged. It's very specific. So you can go to the legislation and kind of read it, and we'll have that coming in the next couple of months in our Affordable Housing Development Resources tool. So once it does get allocated, you'll kind of know what to expect.
Thank you so much, Alysha. Um, I am going to now turn it over to Sean, and he's going to walk us through any proposed substantive housing related bills that made it through the session or not.
Thanks, Amy. Good morning, everybody. Um, Again, I'm Sean Ghio, Policy Director at Partnership for Strong Community. Some of these bills that I'll just go touch on briefly, as Alysha already talked about them in the context of the budget. But so what housing related bills passed this legislative session? There aren't a lot to talk about, but we'll see in front of you. We have SB1, there's homestead property tax exemption. SB1 is the budget bill. And also within the budget bill, there's an aging in place grant program specifics, which Alysha already covered. The homestead property tax exemption allows municipalities to institute an exemption for owner occupied housing. And it is an opt-in for municipalities to choose. Again, as with some of the other budgetary items that Alysha mentioned, that's certainly a benefit to certain if it's enacted in a municipality to certain homeowners. But again, leaves out the third of residents of the state that rent their homes. Um, Additionally, there in HB 5003, there's a down payment assistance program that targeted to first responders. So that requires Connecticut Housing Finance Authority to offer a down payment assistance program. There's not new funding identified for that. I believe it's within available funding, and the applicants, those eligible, are limited to in the statute to very specific professions. A definition of first responders to emergency medical technicians, firefighters, paramedics, or police officers. We'll wait and see how that program gets rolled out by CHAFA in the coming time. HB 5464, we heard about homeless encampment removal reform. Alysha just mentioned that. SB 335 is a small bill around tenant utility metering, requiring uh, separate metering for renters if the landlord chooses to charge for, to have the tenant pay for utilities. And lastly was HB 5259, which is a codification of the Federal McKinney-Vento Assistance Act. It's a state law. Again, as with several things in this year's session, in response to changes and uncertainty at the federal level, this codifies those protections into state law. So that's really what, outside of the budget and inside the budget, what we have for housing bills passed this legislative session. At the partnership, we try to look at policy as it relates to housing affordability, housing stability, and housing choice and creation, and whether or not the policy actually will measurably improve these uh, factors. So are these significant policy changes? Will they meaningfully increase the number of homes that can be built, especially those for that are affordable to lower income households? Will the policies lower the costs of actually constructing the homes? Will they improve housing affordability in other ways for low and moderate income households? And will they improve resident security in their home? So when we look back at those bills that did pass in the previous slide, I'll leave it to some of you to make your own judgments. But while, of course, there are individuals that will benefit from each of these, I believe, largely, I don't think we can think of these bills as large systemic change, the kind that we know is required and that we've been all been clamoring for from our state government for a number of years. I don't think there's any other way to describe these acts, these statutes, as other than minor fixes or expansions of existing programs. Next slide. So what didn't happen this session? Well, first, we'll limit our discussion to the bills that were raised. Of course, there's many policies that we know impact housing affordability that were not raised this session. So we'll limit ourselves to missed opportunities. And the most significant one in my mind, for the third year, the legislature failed to act on the just cause bill, expanding just cause eviction protections, which is an expansion of existing law for a long time now. Seniors and disabled renters have benefited from these protections. For the third session, there was a bill to expand that more broadly to most other tenants. And again, that bill was not called. This is despite having significantly more public support in the legislature, publicly supported by 72 co-sponsors, including Senate President Pro Tem Looney, Senate Majority Leader Duff. Both Housing Committee co-chairs made this their really their priority. Representative Felipe and Senator Marks and Governor Lamont publicly supported the bill, including publicly at an event towards the end of the session. Despite all that, the bill was not called for a vote. I think, of course, that leaves us all to wonder why. And I know the partnership, we support this bill. It's been part of our priority agenda for the 3 years, and we really wait to talk and learn more from the leaders of the coalition that have been pushing for this for 3 years. The Connecticut Tenants Union, Connecticut Fair Housing Center, Make the Road Connecticut, and really look to follow their lead as we move forward and plan for the 2027 legislative session. Next. And a lot of this Alysha covered their partnership. We know there's been some good news in the budget regarding rental assistance program. The partnership has been advocating for a few years to expand this immensely successful program. RAP remains one of the best ways to improve families' housing security, both cost effective and in terms of timeliness. Of course, we know any expansion of RAP has to come with expansion in supply of housing. These folks with vouchers need to be able to find homes. And we know that those two policies really have to go hand in hand, but we'll continue to push through our advocacy and our research the necessity of expanding this really successful program. Next. So a few other missed opportunities. And there were others. I'd just like to highlight a few. The first, SB 151, was raised by House co-chair Senator Martha Marks. It was a really a great bill around reforming minimum lot size requirements in the state. This is getting into wonky zoning territory, but one of the most significant unnecessary cost drivers for housing construction are unnecessarily large minimum lot size requirements. And Connecticut really has historically been a leader in this in terms of not something we want to lead in terms of having excessively large minimum lot sizes. This bill was an effort to begin to remedy some of that. Unfortunately, that wasn't called. HB 5396, YIGBY, Yes in God's Backyard bill, folks refer to it as, it would have made it easier for faith organizations to build affordable housing on their own land. That was voted favorably out of committee, out of the Planning and Development Committee, but was in the end not called. I think it was an incredible effort by faith-based organizations led by Connect and Ghio, if you're familiar with those folks. And we're very happy to be part of that effort to try to push that bill. We think it's common sense, mission-driven way to expand affordable housing. And it's been successful in a number of other states. So we hope and encourage them to bring that bill back again. Alysha mentioned there were two renters tax credit bills brought forward, HB 5114, I noted here. The Golden Girls bill, which our friends from Homes Connecticut pushed and was ultimately not called in the House, although it passed through the Senate. And this would allow make it easier to homeowners to rent rooms in their home to unrelated individuals. Had bipartisan support in the committee, had bipartisan support in the Senate, but for some reason was not called in the House. It seemed like low-hanging fruit, a simple thing that is certainly a traditional means of many of people renting homes. I did this myself as a young man, and some of us that are older directly remembered a Golden Girls show where it didn't seem like such an odd thing. So hopefully we'll see that get through next year. HB 5362 was the Majority Leaders Roundtable bill, which was a very large bill, but that included some things that I'll talk about in the next slide, but that were not necessarily positive, but it did have some positive elements to it, and one of which was requiring towns to report on A30G decisions to report to the state. Unfortunately, this is even though A30G has been around for more than 3 decades, it's hard to find. We don't have concrete information that's easily studied around A30G decisions. So I think this is a missed opportunity to learn more about the law. And finally, SB 274 would have increased penalties for repeat violations of building and fire codes and require non-resident landlords to register personally identifiable information. Um, these are very common sense bill. I'm not sure again why this what the reasoning is behind this not passing, and it's really when you see bills like this that improve folks' safety, improve the accountability of landlords to their residents, and so it's a real disappointment to see this is not able to make its way through the legislature. Next. So threats avoided. Um, I'm going to focus on Section 830G, and this could probably be its own webinar, and for the few people that really want to hear about 830G. So it is not that. So I'll keep this brief and say, as with really every session that I've been involved with, which is now 10, and I'm sure going back further than that, there were concerted efforts to weaken the Affordable Housing Appeals Act. A30G remains one of the few tools available in the state to create affordable housing in towns that simply refuse to allow new housing or put up, continue to use every barrier they can to limit the ability of housing to be built in their communities, particularly affordable housing. So this year was no different. There were many bills working to weaken A30G. Most prominently, though, I mentioned the Majority Leaders Roundtable bill. It was technically, I think, called the Recommendations of the Majority Leader Roundtable bill, and it was a large bill, and it had a few provisions that would have served to weaken Section 830G. In the end, that bill did not move forward. It was amended, but then ultimately was not voted on. So I think A30G continues to be, a boogeyman in a lot of communities when, in fact, we know most communities really don't see A30G applications. And because it really only works in certain kinds of communities where developers think they can totally subsidize the affordable units and still be able to make a development finance properly. So unfortunately, it still drives a lot of the conversation at the legislature around affordable housing, and it really is one of the only tools we have in place, and it's a necessary evil that we're going to continue to defend it and try to explain it to our legislative leaders. Let's see, what do we have next? I think that might be it. Yeah, so that was a lot of ground. And Amy, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Sean. And also thank you for your incredible work. You're kind of an institution in your knowledge and kind of making it simpler for everybody to understand. So really appreciate you. Kind of transitioning off of the Appeals Act, thinking about back to Just Cause, I know that was such a top priority for us, and it was disappointing that it didn't get called for a vote again this session, even with the support of the governor and many others. Opponents, having tracked the session and being at the Capitol, you hear the opponents of that bill claiming that it would make neighborhoods less safe and create forever tenancies. For problematic tenants or others. How would you counteract that argument, which seemed to be pretty pervasive and get people very worried?
Well, first I'd say I don't think it's a fair fight to start. On one side, we have tenants that are trying to self-organize, and along with a few other sort of traditional advocacy organizations like ourselves and many others to support them. And on the other side, you have landlords who have a financial interest in maintaining the status quo, right? The resources available to one greatly outweigh the other. And I think we saw some of that over the session with truly atrocious arguments being made, including through push text messaging and emails and phone calls, basically lying. And or for those of a certain age, might remember the Willie Horton ads during Governor Mike Dukakis's run. Some of these texts reminded me and I don't say this lightly, they were racist, and I think really um, the folks behind those that kind of rhetoric to try to stop a bill should be ashamed of themselves, and really just reinforces my belief in working even harder next session to expose those kind of lies and to really push our advocacy. But to specifically ask your question in terms of problematic forever leases, problematic tenants, that argument forgets that there are many valid reasons to evict a tenant for cause. None of those are going to be changed if just cause eviction protections are expanded. And if the argument is that landlords don't want to go through with an eviction, even though they had cause, that's why they want to be able to just not extend a lease, well, too bad, right? Go through the work of getting rid of a problem tenant through the law and stop using no fault evictions to do that work for you.
Thank you. And in fact, I believe the statute actually created another, gave another reason for landlords to be able to evict around moving family members in. So it clearly delineates the statute and the Office of Legislative Research explaining kind of all of those reasons, whether it's non-payment or being a nuisance and all of those things that remain as cause. So,
Yep.
you
I
know,
mean, it,
sorry, go ahead.
no, absolutely. I was just going to say, there's many folks that are argue against the policies that the partnership and other advocates promote with good in good faith and for good reasons. Uh, I'd I'd like to see the opponents of just cause eviction limit themselves to truthful arguments and not uh, use really racist and classist arguments to try to stoke fear among people. It's not just limited to just cause debate. I think I would like all advocates to just limit ourselves to the facts, right?
Right.
Um,
That's it. And I think that that's fair. Um, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. I'll ask one more question to, oh, Alysha, did you?
I see two that have
Oh,
popped.
okay.
Um, do you want me to go ahead and read
Yes, go
those
ahead.
off? Yeah, sure. So on Just Cause, because we're still talking about it, there's a question that as a tenants union member, I'm interested to hear if there are any strategies or approaches that you think the union and our coalition can implement more effectively to increase the chances of passing the expanded Just Cause next year.
yeah, I mentioned earlier that we really do want to hear more from the tenants union and Fair Housing Center, Make the Road Connecticut, other advocates to try sort of understand what happened in this session. I think so. I don't have any clear answers. As we mentioned, there's a very large number of co-sponsors. It's clear that a great deal of the legislators understand the, how this is a significant policy and want to pass it. So I think really the next 6 months or so, it's really going to be incumbent on all of us to try to understand, well, then why wasn't it called? And I don't have any answers to that yet. I will say that we will be supporting if this bill comes back, we will be supporting it, and we will do all we can to advocate for it honestly, and try to be good partners to the leaders of the coalition.
I think it's also important to acknowledge the role of folks doing their research, and both understanding statutory language, what's being proposed, as well as what your elected represented officials, how they're voting. And we are powerful as constituents, and it's important to reach out to your elected officials. And I know the tenants union was ever present at the LOB, and they did a really great job this session. There's one more question here about efforts. There were efforts to push the timelines for zoning regulations that need to be established by this July, set out in the housing growth bill for the commercial areas. Do you think there will be a special session to address this, or will the timeline stick?
I'm not aware of any conversation on a special session, but I wouldn't be probably any more than any of you folks on the call. That's not something I've heard about. So no, I don't know if um, anyone else has.
Any other questions? Please enter or utilize the links that were shared in the chat earlier to get a written analysis based on what we covered today. And I'm going to pass it on to Danielle to share a couple opportunities and closing thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. And thank you, Sean and Alysha, for all your hard work throughout the session. I'm here to talk very briefly about some of the opportunities beyond session. We, as housing advocates, are working year-round to try and influence legislation, not just during the legislative session. And we want you to all view it similarly. This is an ongoing conversation we're having, not one that starts and stops when the legislative session ends as well. So. Like I said, it doesn't stop just during the legislative session. Some ways that you can get involved in advocacy is sharing our wealth of resources, reports, fact sheets, information on social media, with reporters in your community or across the state, and also with your elected officials. Socializing these topics, the simplicity and the obvious nature of some of these policies should be a constant conversation we're having. So making sure that we're reiterating that, not just during the session, but throughout the year with our elected officials and folks who are reporting on these issues is really important. To that end, you can also submit op-eds. It's really important that we're hearing how these policies are impacting individuals, and opinion pieces are a really great way to share an individual or community story about the experiences of housing policy, either improving or challenging the quality of life for folks. And another great way to get involved, and it's probably the least exciting way to get involved, but it's so important, is participating in your local planning and zoning meetings. Any conversations that are happening around housing locally within your community, in your neighborhood, are some of the most important conversations we have. We're championing a lot of these efforts at the state legislative level and also in conversations with our federal delegates, but the ball doesn't stop there, and a lot of the work and the the wheels for housing advocacy happen locally. So be a part of those conversations. Make sure your perspective is heard in those spaces. It goes a really long way. And also let us know how you want to be involved. You can use this QR code. It's just a way for us to assess from our network of advocates what you're most interested in doing. So if you really love writing, maybe we'll help coordinate with you to write a blog or an op-ed. If you really love public speaking, then we'll coordinate with you on events or participating during the legislative session, providing testimony. There's so many different ways you can get involved. So please let us know how you want to do that, and we will work with you to bring you into the fold of housing advocacy. Other great ways to get involved is our State of Housing in Connecticut report is a great one-stop shop sort of primer on the lay of the land with housing policy in the state. This is something we'll be updating on, I believe, an annual basis, so there will always be new information and updates to reference here. And I also want to allude back to some of the questions that Sean had asked earlier on in this presentation. I think it's a really great way to frame what you're looking to accomplish, is thinking about what the vision we want to achieve is. We're asking questions that relate strictly to the partnership's vision for change, but I think it's a really important way to orient yourself to the conversation is where would you like to see Connecticut end up? And how does the data support that? We've talked about that as well as grounding ourselves in the facts and data that are available, and this is a great place to find them. And I'm certainly biased, but it is a really great report and a very valuable read, so please take a look and at least familiarize yourself with it. Other opportunities is we've got a couple of events coming up. One is happening soon. Wednesday, June 3rd, we'll be at the Mattituck Museum in Waterbury. We'll be talking with tenant organizers. We'll be talking with folks organizing across the country as well as within Connecticut, looking at the history of organizing around tenant issues in Connecticut, where we are now, what we've learned historically, and what we can learn from other communities across the country. Not just for tenant organizers. This is a conversation about how tenant organizing factors into the broader landscape of advocacy. So we'll be talking about how it functions differently, how it functions similarly, and how we can all be working together to drive this sort of broader reform we're looking for. So I really hope to see you there. It's going to be a great conversation, and we've got some great speakers lined up. More information to come out on that, so stay tuned on our social medias, but would really love to see you there. It's going to be a great day and a lot of great learning. And additionally, forever and always, I will be promoting our conference. We host it every November. This year, it'll be November 16th and 17th. Right now, it's just to save the date, although we are gearing up to put out our call for proposals. So if you have an idea you would like to see brought to this year's conference, stay tuned, sign up for our newsletters. We'll be promoting that in the next couple of months. But the conference is always a really great place to plug in, do some networking, learn about what's going on across Connecticut, across the country. We'll also be rallying some of our legislative leaders and champions on housing policy to talk about what occurred this session. So if you want a continuation of today's conversation with some of those folks, we'll be doing that there as well. So we always hope to see you there. It's free. It'll be virtual again this year. So it's very accessible in terms of participation. And last but not least, please let us know how we did today on our webinar. You can scan this QR. I will also send it out alongside the recording and the slides from today's presentation. But we would love to have you help inform how we're doing, how we're communicating information, if we're making it easy for you to identify ways to participate in the process. We want to hear from you and make sure that we're giving you the best information to take and run with to help create meaningful impact and change in the housing space. So appreciate you all being here with us on this Friday morning. And that is really what we've got for you today. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll stay on for another minute or two in case folks have questions since we wrapped up a little bit early. But stay in touch. We look forward to continuing this work with you beyond session and during session when we come back again next year. So thank you all for being here with us and appreciate all you have done.